The winter of 1854 descended upon the Illinois prairie with a bitter, unyielding grip. Outside the small farmhouse of Thomas and Martha Miller, the wind howled like a hungry wolf piling snow against the rough-hewn timber walls. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of boiling water, sweat, and a primal fear that was far colder than the wind. Martha, her face pale and beaded with perspiration, lay in the modest rope bed, her knuckles white as she gripped the patchwork quilt. Every muscle in her body screamed in a chorus of agony that had lasted for the better part of a day. Thomas, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the certainty of an axe handle or the reins of a plow horse, felt useless. He paced the worn floorboards of the main room, his heavy boots making a soft, rhythmic thud that did little to soothe his frayed nerves. He'd fetch more water, stoke the fire, and offer words of encouragement that felt hollow and foolish in the face of such monumental effort. Agnes, the town midwife and a woman whose face was a roadmap of every birth and death in the county for the last 30 years, was a bastion of calm. "Patience, Thomas," she'd murmur, not taking her eyes off Martha. "The good Lord works in His own time." But the Lord, it seemed, was working overtime. After a final, earth-shattering push that drew a cry from Martha that was equal parts pain and release, the first baby arrived. A boy, small but with a lusty cry that filled the small room. Thomas felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. But Agnes's work was not done. Her brow furrowed. "Hold on, Martha," she said, her voice taut. "There's more." What followed was a blur of exhausting, bewildering labor. A second boy, then a third, and to the utter astonishment of everyone in the room, a fourth. 4 sons. All small but all breathing, all pink, and all miraculously alive. As the sun finally broke through the gray morning sky, casting long, weak shadows across the snow, the Miller farmhouse was no longer a home for 2, but for 6. The news would ripple through the small community near Peoria like a shockwave. Martha Miller had birthed quadruplets. The initial months were a chaotic symphony of survival. The boys, who they named Samuel, Elijah, Isaac, and Jacob, were nearly identical, a quartet of tiny faces and grasping hands. Distinguishing them was a daily challenge, solved only by a small, colored ribbon Martha tied around each wrist, blue for Samuel, green for Elijah, red for Isaac, and yellow for Jacob. Their lives became a relentless cycle of feeding, changing, and rocking. The community, a mix of God-fearing farmers and their practical wives, responded with a mixture of awe and pity. They brought stews, mended clothes, and offered to watch the brood for an hour so Martha could simply sit in silence. But they also whispered in the pews at church and over fences, wondering if such an event was a blessing or a strange omen. It was during one of these grueling, repetitive afternoons that the first sign appeared, a thread of the uncanny, woven into the fabric of their exhausting reality. Martha was changing Samuel on the kitchen table. He was fussy, wriggling as she tried to fasten his cloth diaper. The pin, sharp and unforgiving, slipped from her numb fingers and pricked the soft flesh of his calf. Samuel's cry was instantaneous, a sharp, piercing shriek of pain. But it wasn't the only one. From the adjoining room, where Thomas was attempting to rock the other 3 to sleep in a large, custom-built cradle, came an identical trio of shrieks. Thomas rushed into the kitchen, his face a mask of confusion. What happened? They all just started screaming. Martha, her heart pounding, looked from Samuel's crying face to the doorway where Thomas stood bewildered. She examined the other boys. Elijah, Isaac, and Jacob were all crying hysterically, each instinctively clutching at their right calf, the very same spot where Samuel had been pricked. There was no mark on them, no reason for their distress. "The pin," Martha whispered, holding it up. "It pricked Samuel." They looked at each other, a silent question passing between them. A coincidence, they reasoned. Babies are sensitive. One cries, they all cry. It had to be. But the coincidences began to stack up, like stones building a wall of impossibility. When Elijah began teething, his gums swollen and sore, all four boys became inconsolable for a week. They refused to eat, their shared feverish misery filling the small house with a constant, wearying wail. When Isaac, the most adventurous of the four, was learning to crawl, he misjudged the distance to the floor and bumped his forehead on a loose plank. He let out a startled yelp, and in the next room, his three brothers, who had been sleeping soundly, all whimpered and stirred at the exact same moment, their tiny hands fluttering towards their own foreheads. Thomas and Martha could no longer dismiss it. It was a pattern, as reliable and unnerving as the rising sun. A pain to one was a pain to all. As practical, religious people, they were unequipped for this. Their world was governed by the tangible, the richness of the soil, the health of their livestock, the predictable turn of the seasons. This was something else. It felt ancient, a mystery that belonged to a world of folklore and superstition they had been taught to reject. Fear began to curdle the joy of their son's survival. Was this a divine connection, a sign of their special place in God's plan, or was it an affliction, a curse that bound them together in a web of shared suffering? The uncertainty gnawed at them. After weeks of hushed, late-night conversations, they decided they needed an outside opinion, a voice of reason. They would speak to Dr. Abram Hayes. Dr. Hayes was a man of science, a graduate from a respectable college back east. He drove a smart buggy and carried a black leather bag filled with instruments that represented logic and the new age of medicine. He was the antithesis of the whispers and superstition that thrived in the rural quiet. Dr. Hayes arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves on the cottonwood trees a blaze of gold. He listened politely as Martha, her hands twisting in her apron, explained their observations. She told him about the pinprick, the teething, the bumped head. Thomas stood beside her, nodding in solemn agreement, feeling foolish as the words left his wife's mouth. He could see the skepticism crystallizing in the doctor's eyes. Mrs. Miller, Mr. Miller, Dr. Hayes said, his voice patient but patronizing. You have endured an extraordinary ordeal. Raising 4 infants at once would tax the sanity of a saint. It is perfectly understandable that you are seeing patterns. It's a known phenomenon. One baby cries, it startles the others. They are remarkably sympathetic to each other's distress. It is a sign of a normal, healthy bond, nothing more. He examined each boy, pronouncing them small but robust. He patted Thomas on the shoulder. Get some rest, both of you. Your sons are fine. Your imagination is simply working overtime. His dismissal was a cold splash of water. It was one thing to harbor their own doubts. It was another to have them validated and dismissed by the one man they thought could offer an explanation. They were alone with their secret once more, now with the added weight of being seen as hysterical or foolish. The final proof, the one that shattered any lingering hope of a rational explanation, came a few weeks later. The first chill of winter had returned, and a fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a welcome comfort. The boys, now nearly a year old, were crawling on a thick blanket spread on the floor. Jacob, ever curious, crawled away from his brothers toward the enticing glow. Before Martha could intercept him, he reached out a tiny hand and pressed his palm flat against a brick at the edge of the hearth. It wasn't hot enough to cause a serious injury, but it was warm enough to sting. Jacob's scream was sharp and immediate, and at the very same instant, so were the screams of Samuel, Elijah, and Isaac across the room. They all recoiled as if they'd been struck by lightning, their faces contorting in identical masks of pain. Martha snatched Jacob up, her heart leaping into her throat. As she soothed him, Thomas quickly gathered the other 3. It was then they saw it. On Jacob's small palm, an angry red mark was already forming from the heat, and on the identical palms of Samuel, Elijah, and Isaac, who had been nowhere near the fire, the same red mark was appearing, blooming on their skin like a phantom injury, a stark, impossible testament to their shared existence. They were 4 bodies with a single, indivisible nerve, and no one in the world would believe them. 7 years passed. There were 7 years of calloused hands and aching backs for Thomas, of worried nights and furrowed brows for Martha. For the boys, they were years of discovery, a slow, shared education in the strange grammar of their existence. The farm was their entire world, a sprawling kingdom of 160 acres, where the only laws that mattered were the turning of the seasons and the unbreakable rule of their shared flesh. They learned that a splinter in Jacob's foot while mending a fence was a sharp, sudden agony for all four. They learned that a bee's sting on Isaac's neck as he gathered wildflowers was a fiery torment they all suffered under the shade of the great oak. They learned to move with a strange, subconscious grace, a 4-part choreography designed to prevent accidental harm. Samuel, the eldest by minutes, became the watcher, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Elijah was the spark, his adventurous spirit the most common source of their collective pain. Isaac, the most sensitive, carried the emotional echo of every bump and scrape, while Jacob, the pragmatist, was always looking for safer, more sensible ways to accomplish any task. But the farm could not be their world forever. The whispers in the nearby town of Prairie Creek had not died. They had merely settled, like dust, waiting for a wind to stir them up again. The Miller quadruplets, the identical boys who were never seen apart. As they turned 7, the question of schooling became a quiet battleground in the farmhouse. They need to learn their letters, Thomas. More than I can teach, Martha argued one evening, her hands twisting in her apron. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the wall, making the small room feel even more confined. They need to be around other children. They can't live on this farm like hermits for the rest of their days. Thomas stared into his empty cup of coffee, the lines around his eyes deeper than they were 7 years ago. And what happens when one of them falls in the schoolyard, Martha? What happens when Caleb Finch's boy pushes Elijah and all 4 of them cry out holding the same arm? You know how people talk. They already think we're strange. We'll teach them to be careful, Martha insisted, her voice trembling but firm. We'll tell them they must be brave. What other choice do we have? To keep them locked away is a different kind of cruelty. The argument was won not by logic but by the weight of that fear. The fear of what they would become if they never knew a world beyond their own fence line. And so, on a crisp September morning in 1861, with the nation itself fracturing under the pressures of war, Martha dressed her 4 sons in identical, freshly starched shirts and dungarees. She knelt before them, her hands on the shoulders of Samuel and Elijah. You listen to me, she said, her voice low and intense. You look after each other. You are careful. If one of you is hurt, you do not make a spectacle. You bite your tongue. You be strong. Do you understand me? 4 identical heads nodded in unison, their expressions a mixture of excitement and a learned, solemn gravity that no 7-year-old should possess. The one-room schoolhouse stood a mile down the road, a squat, whitewashed building that smelled of chalk dust, aging paper, and the wood smoke curling from its stone chimney. Their teacher, Mrs. Gable, was a stern-faced woman in her 50s with a reputation for discipline and a low tolerance for foolishness. When the 4 Miller boys walked in, a hush fell over the 24 students. They were a local legend made real, an unnerving marvel of sameness. Mrs. Gable, however, was unfazed. Find a seat, boys. We're working on our sums. They chose a bench near the back, moving as one. The morning passed in a blur of scraped slate and chanted alphabets. They were acutely aware of the stolen glances, the whispered comments. The first test came before noon. Jacob, trying to arrange his slate, let it slip from his fingers. It hit the wooden floor with a clatter and landed squarely on his right foot. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, escaped from 4 mouths. Samuel, Elijah, Isaac, and Jacob all flinched violently, their right hands flying to clutch their right feet, their faces contorting in a shared grimace of pain. The moment was fleeting, but it did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Gable's eyes narrowed from the front of the room. She saw 4 boys react to a single accident. A strange coincidence, she thought, filing it away as an oddity of identical siblings. The real trial came during the midday recess. The boys, hesitant at first, were drawn to the sprawling branches of an old oak tree that dominated the schoolyard. Other children gave them a wide berth, treating them like a single, unpredictable creature, except for one. Caleb Finch, a boy of 9 with a swagger born of size and ignorance, saw them not as a marvel, but as a target. "Look at the 4 little mice," Caleb sneered, kicking a stone in their direction. Too scared to play, Elijah, his pride stung, squared his shoulders. "We ain't scared of you." To prove it, he broke from his brother's protective orbit and scrambled up the lowest hanging branch of the oak, a feat he'd performed 100 times at home. But the schoolyard was not home. His confidence was brittle, his focus fractured by Caleb's taunts and the dozen pairs of eyes on him. As he reached to pull himself higher, his foot slipped on a patch of moss. He didn't fall far, only a few feet to the ground, but his left forearm scraped violently against the rough, unforgiving bark. A long, angry abrasion, beaded with blood, tore across his skin. Elijah cried out, a sharp yelp of pain and surprise, and at that exact instant, a wave of agony washed over his brothers. 20 feet away, Samuel, who had been watching with anxious eyes, doubled over, his own left arm clutched to his chest. Isaac, standing beside him, let out a choked sob, his face paling as he stared in horror at his own forearm. Jacob, who had turned to walk away, stumbled as if he'd been struck, his hand instinctively grabbing the source of the searing pain. The 3 of them, untouched and unharmed, were reacting to a wound that wasn't theirs. Then the impossible happened. Before the stunned eyes of the other children, a faint red line appeared on Samuel's arm, and on Isaac's, and on Jacob's. In the space of a few heartbeats, the lines deepened, mirroring the exact shape, size, and severity of the gash on Elijah's skin. 4 identical wounds on 4 identical arms, born from a single moment of misfortune. The schoolyard erupted. A girl screamed. Several younger children backed away, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. Caleb Finch, who had been smirking moments before, went pale. He had seen it. They had all seen it. This wasn't a quirk. This wasn't sympathy. This was something else entirely, something unnatural. Mrs. Gable came running, her stern composure shattered. She knelt beside Elijah, then her eyes darted to the other 3, each cradling an identical bleeding wound. She looked from one arm to the next, her mind refusing to compute the reality before her. She touched Isaac's arm, half expecting the wound to be an illusion, but her finger came away slick with blood. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this?" Thomas was summoned from his field, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He and Martha stood before Mrs. Gable in the now empty schoolhouse, the setting sun casting long, accusatory shadows through the windows. The boys sat silently on their bench, their identical wounds now clean and bandaged by their mother, 4 white strips of cloth, a testament to the disaster. "I cannot explain what I saw, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Gable said, her voice regaining its sternness, but edged with a deep, unsettling fear. "It is not natural for 3 boys to bleed from a wound inflicted on a 4th. "They are very close, ma'am," Thomas stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was the same weak explanation he'd given Dr. Hayes years ago. An extreme sympathy. "It's always been this way." "This is beyond sympathy," she retorted, shaking her head. "This is a thing that will frighten people. It frightens me. I cannot have this in my school. The other children are terrified." There was nothing more to be said. The boys' first day of school was also their last. They walked home in the twilight, the mile-long journey feeling like a funeral procession. The secret was out, no longer contained by the walls of their home. It was now a living thing, a rumor that would spread like wildfire through the dry fields of Prairie Creek. Back in the quiet safety of the farmhouse, the boys sat at the kitchen table, the silence heavier than any scolding. The scrape on their arms was a dull throb. but it was nothing compared to the new, deeper ache they felt. It was the pain of being different, of being seen as monsters. Isaac began to cry, not for the physical hurt, but for the looks on the other children's faces. Samuel, the silent guardian, moved to his side and put an arm around his trembling shoulders. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was hard, his jaw set. The world was not their friend. They had no one but each other. The farm was no longer just their kingdom, it was now their fortress. The 7 years that followed the school incident bled into one another, each season marked not by holidays or community gatherings, but by the rhythms of the farm and the ever-present, silent hum of the brothers' connection. By 1868, the quadruplets were 14, no longer boys but not yet men, caught in that awkward space where their bodies were lanky and their voices were unreliable. Their world had shrunk to the 100 acres of the Miller farm, a kingdom of cornfields, a dense hickory grove, and a weathered barn that smelled of hay and earth. This isolation had forged them into a singular unit of 4 distinct parts. Samuel, the firstborn by minutes, had embraced the role of protector with a grim solemnity. Elijah was the restless one, his eyes often straying to the horizon, a flicker of rebellion in his spirit. Isaac, quiet and observant, had become the keeper of their shared emotional state, sensing shifts in mood before a word was spoken. And Jacob, ever the pragmatist, focused on the mechanics of their life, finding solace in the logic of mending a fence or tending to the livestock. They had learned to navigate their bond with a strange grace. A splinter in Jacob's thumb while fixing a wagon wheel would cause a collective flinch, a murmured curse from Samuel, a sharp intake of breath from Elijah, and a wince from Isaac. They moved with an unconscious synchronicity, harvesting corn with a 4-man rhythm that was brutally efficient, their movements coordinated by the silent, instantaneous feedback loop of shared exertion and minor pains. Their mother, Martha, had taken over their education, teaching them to read from the family Bible and a few worn primers. Thomas taught them the land, but no lesson could prepare them for the invisible walls that now surrounded their property. Trips into the nearby town of Fairfield were rare and fraught with tension. When Thomas needed supplies he couldn't grow or make, he would take one of the boys, rotating the duty as if to distribute the burden of public scorn. This time it was Elijah's turn. The air in town was thick with a suspicion that had festered over the years. The whispers that had started after the school incident had mutated into something darker. People no longer just stared, they recoiled. Mothers pulled their children closer, their faces tight with fear. Men at the general store would fall silent as Thomas and Elijah entered, their conversations only resuming in hushed, hostile tones after they'd left. The label of unnatural had stuck, and in the fertile soil of rural superstition, it had grown into tales of witchcraft, of a curse on the Miller land. As they loaded sacks of flour onto the wagon, Elijah overheard a snippet of conversation from 2 women clutching their shawls nearby. "The devil's own," one hissed. "They say their minds are linked too, a hive of wrongness." The words were like wasps, stinging and persistent. Elijah's jaw tightened, and a hot flash of shame and anger pulsed through him. Instantly, 300 yards away on the farm, Samuel, Isaac, and Jacob felt it, not as a clear thought, but as a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety, a phantom heat on the back of their necks. Samuel, who was chopping wood, paused mid-swing, scanning the placid fields for a threat he couldn't see. The injustice of it gnawed at Elijah all the way home, the gentle rocking of the wagon doing nothing to soothe his simmering resentment. He was tired of hiding. He was tired of being a monster in a story he never wrote. That evening, the simmering tension boiled over in the cavernous space of the barn. A summer storm was gathering, the air growing heavy and charged, mirroring the atmosphere among the brothers. Elijah, still bristling from the trip to town, had climbed into the high loft, seeking a space that was his alone. He stood on a thick wooden beam, 20 feet above the hay-strewn floor, balancing precariously as he stared out the hayloft door at the bruised, purple clouds. "Get down from there, Elijah," Samuel's voice called from below. It wasn't a request. "I'm fine," Elijah snapped back, not looking down. "It's not like I can fall without you feeling it, is it? You'll be my safety net." The words were laced with a bitterness that was new, a weaponization of their shared curse. "That's not funny. It's foolish," Samuel said, his voice tight with the familiar weight of responsibility. He started climbing the ladder. "You know the rules. No needless risks." "I'm tired of your rules." Elijah spun around on the beam, his sudden movement making him wobble. "I'm tired of living in a cage built to protect us from a scraped knee. Did you hear them in town, Samuel? Do you know what they call us? They think we're demons. Hiding here, being careful, it doesn't change anything. It just proves them right." Jacob and Isaac, drawn by the raised voices, stood at the entrance to the barn, watching the confrontation with growing unease. They could feel the anger radiating from both brothers, a discordant thrum that was physically uncomfortable, like a low-grade fever. "What they think doesn't matter," Samuel said, his face level with the loft floor now. "Keeping us safe is what matters. Get down." No, it was a simple act of defiance, but it was everything. Elijah took a deliberate step backward along the beam, his boot heel slipping on a patch of loose chaff. He flailed, his arms windmilling for balance. Samuel lunged forward, grabbing for his brother's shirt. He caught a fistful of fabric, but his momentum, combined with Elijah's, pulled them both off balance. They didn't fall, not completely. Samuel's grip held, but Elijah's left arm scraped hard against the rough-hewn edge of the beam, a long, deep gouge from wrist to elbow. The pain was immediate and blinding, but it was more than just the tearing of skin. For the first time, the physical pain was inextricably tangled with the raw, acidic emotions of their fight, Elijah's furious resentment and Samuel's terrified anger. The effect was catastrophic. Down below, Isaac and Jacob screamed. It wasn't a sympathetic cry. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated agony. They collapsed to the ground, clutching their own left arms as if they'd been branded with a hot iron. Blood, impossibly, began to well up from their unbroken skin, tracing the exact path of Elijah's wound. In the loft, Samuel and Elijah stared at each other, horrified, the intensity of the shared pain stealing their breath. It was a searing, white-hot agony that vibrated with the frequency of their mutual rage, a pain far greater than the sum of its parts. It was the physical manifestation of a fractured bond. Martha and Thomas came running, alerted by the screams. They burst into the barn to a scene of chaos. Isaac and Jacob writhing on the floor, Samuel and Elijah frozen in the loft, their faces pale with shock, and the coppery scent of blood hanging heavy in the storm-charged air. It was into this tableau of pain and disarray that a new sound intruded, the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. They all froze. Visitors were so rare as to be non-existent. Thomas cautiously moved to the barn door, peering out into the twilight. A black carriage, familiar yet unwelcome, had stopped near the house. A man, older now, his hair grayer, but his posture just as erect, was stepping down. It was Dr. Abram Hayes. He had not set foot on their property in 14 years, but the persistent, lurid rumors had finally worn down his professional skepticism, replacing it with a scientific curiosity that was, in its own way, more terrifying than the town's superstitious fear. He looked toward the barn, his gaze analytical, and saw the flicker of panicked movement within. He was no longer here to soothe anxious parents. He was here to investigate an anomaly. The world had shrunk to the space of a single, searing point of agony on his forearm. For Samuel, the splintered wood of the barn floor pressed into his cheek, the smell of hay and old iron filling his nostrils, but it was all distant, muted by the thrumming, white-hot pain. He could hear his mother's frantic cry, a sound that seemed to come from across a great valley. He could feel the vibrations of his father's heavy boots on the floorboards. But the only true reality was the wound, a shared, fourfold torment that pulsed in time with his own terrified heartbeat. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze snapping to his brothers. They were scattered like fallen soldiers. Elijah was propped against a stack of hay bales, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his usual defiance replaced by a stunned horror. Isaac had curled into a ball near the watering trough, whimpering softly, while Jacob lay flat on his back, his eyes wide and staring at the rafters as if searching for an answer in the dusty timbers. Each of them cradled their left forearm, where an identical, ragged gash oozed dark blood. It wasn't just a sympathetic mark, it was a wound. Real, deep and bleeding. "Thomas, what is it? What's happened?" Martha's voice was sharp with panic as she knelt, her hands hovering over her son's, unsure of whom to touch first. Thomas stood frozen for a half-second, his face a grim mask of disbelief. He had seen their connection manifest in 1,000 small ways, a shared shiver, a synchronized wince, but this was new, this was violent. His eyes locked on the crimson stain spreading on Elijah's sleeve, then on the matching wounds of the others. The logical part of his mind, the farmer's mind that understood cause and effect, simply broke. "A fight," Samuel managed to gasp, the words tasting of dust and regret. "It was my fault." "No," Elijah rasped from across the barn, his voice strained. "It was mine." Before another word could be spoken, a shadow fell across the wide barn doorway. Dr. Abram Hayes stepped inside, his black leather medical bag clutched in one hand. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that felt like a violation of their sacred, agonizing space. His eyes, sharp and analytical, took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The 4 boys on the ground, the identical injuries, the parents' frantic distress. There was no surprise on his face, only a profound, almost chilling confirmation. "Get out," Thomas boomed, his voice a low growl. He straightened to his full height, positioning himself between the doctor and his sons. "This is private family business. You have no place here." Dr. Hayes held up a placating hand, though his gaze remained fixed on the boys. "Mr. Miller, I assure you, I am not here to pry. I was in the area and I saw the boy fall." He nodded slightly toward Elijah. "Then I saw the others cry out. I am here as a physician." "We don't need a physician," Martha snapped, tearing a strip from her apron to press against Isaac's arm. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were flinty. "We need you to leave us be. Haven't you people done enough, you people?" Dr. Hayes took another step forward, his shoes crunching softly in the scattered straw. "Mrs. Miller, 14 years ago, I dismissed your story. I called it, I believe the term I used was parental anxiety. It was a professional failure, one that has followed me through years of whispers and rumors coming from this town. Rumors I chose to ignore." He paused, his gaze finally meeting Thomas's. "I can ignore them no longer, not after what I just witnessed." His voice was calm, but underneath it, Samuel could sense a current of intense, barely contained excitement. This wasn't just a house call, it was a discovery. They were a discovery. "What you witnessed is our burden," Thomas said, his hands clenched into fists. "Not your scientific curiosity." "Is that what this is?" Dr. Hayes countered, his tone hardening slightly. "A burden to be hidden away? Look at them, man. That wound, it's not a phantom sensation. It's a physical trauma, manifested on all 4 of them from an injury to one. But it's more than that, isn't it? The anger between them, it's made it worse." He gestured to the gash, which continued to well with blood, refusing to clot. "A simple scrape from a fall shouldn't bleed like this. Their emotions are intensifying the physical response. This is evolving. It's becoming more dangerous." His words landed like stones in the heavy silence of the barn. He was right. Samuel knew it. The pain from this injury was different. It was imbued with the venom of his and Elijah's anger, a poisonous feedback loop that made the physical pain sharper, deeper. He saw the same dawning realization in Isaac's and Jacob's eyes. Martha looked from the wound to her husband's defiant face, her own resolve beginning to fracture. She was a mother, and her sons were in pain, a pain she couldn't soothe. a wound that wouldn't heal. Her fear was beginning to outweigh her distrust. "What do you want, doctor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To help," he said simply, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Let me clean and dress those wounds. Let me observe. I don't have answers, I admit that freely. Nothing in my education could have prepared me for this. But I want to understand, for their sake. What happens when one of them breaks a bone or contracts a fever? This connection could kill them all as easily as it binds them. You cannot face that alone." Thomas wrestled with himself, his posture rigid with pride and a deep-seated fear of the outside world. For 14 years, he had built these walls around his family, believing that isolation was their only salvation. Now this man, the very first person to reject their reality, was asking to be let inside, claiming that the walls themselves were now the danger. It was Jacob who broke the stalemate. He let out a pained sob, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. "It hurts, Papa," he cried, his voice small and childlike. "It won't stop." That was it. The sound of his son's plea shattered Thomas's resistance. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of helplessness. He looked at his 4 sons, all sharing the same pain, the same fear, their bond twisted into a mechanism of mutual suffering. He had failed to protect them. Sealing them off from the world had only turned their cage into an echo chamber for their pain. He gave a slow, defeated nod. "All right, doctor, tend to them." Dr. Hayes didn't gloat. He gave a single, respectful nod in return and set his bag down, clicking it open with an efficient snap. The air filled with the clean, antiseptic smell of carbolic acid and rubbing alcohol, a stark contrast to the earthy scents of the barn. He knelt first beside Samuel, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined the arm. "Incredible," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "The tissue damage is identical, not similar, identical." As he began to clean Samuel's wound with a damp cloth, a collective, sharp hiss came from all 4 brothers. Their bodies tensed in unison. Martha watched, her hand covering her mouth, while Thomas stood by like a grim sentinel. Dr. Hayes worked methodically, moving from Samuel to Elijah, then to Isaac, and finally to Jacob. With each boy, his fascination grew, but so did his professional focus. He was no longer just a curious outsider. He was a doctor confronted with a condition that defied all known medical laws. As he carefully wrapped the last bandage around Jacob's arm, the barn was quiet save for the ragged breathing of the boys. The immediate crisis had passed, but a new, more unsettling tension had taken its place. Dr. Hayes had breached their fortress. He was inside, his mind already working, analyzing, forming theories. He was a man of science who had stumbled upon a miracle, and he had no intention of letting it go. He packed his bag, the clicks of the metal clasps echoing in the still air. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on them," he stated, not asked. "We need to talk more. We need a plan." Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the 4 matching white bandages on his son's arms, a uniform of their strange affliction. The world had come crashing back into their lives, not with the fire and pitchforks of superstition he had always feared, but with the quiet, relentless persistence of a man who saw them not as boys, but as a puzzle he was determined to solve. The autumn of 1868 settled over the Miller farm, not with the usual gentle melancholy of harvest, but with a new, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Dr. Abram Hayes had become a fixture, as regular as the morning rooster and as unsettling as a hawk circling overhead. Each day, his buggy would rattle up the lane, and he would step out, his black leather satchel in hand, a man bringing the outside world into their hermitage, whether they wanted it or not. The farmhouse parlor, once a space of quiet family life, was transformed into a makeshift examination room. The scent of Martha's baking now mingled with the sharp, clean smell of carbolic acid. Dr. Hayes was meticulously methodical. His first task had been to document the healing of the identical wounds on the boy's forearms. He'd measure them with calipers, noting the faint differences in scab formation and skin regeneration, his pen scratching furiously in a ledger. "Remarkable symmetry," he'd murmur, more to himself than to anyone else. "Almost identical rates of tissue repair, despite minor variations in diet and activity." The boys endured these sessions with varying degrees of compliance. Samuel, weighed down by a guilt that seemed to have settled permanently in his shoulders, was the most cooperative. He answered every question, held still for every measurement, his eyes fixed on the doctor, as if trying to will a solution into existence. He saw their submission as penance for the fight that had torn their fragile peace apart. Elijah was his opposite. He was a coiled spring of defiance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He met the doctor's professional gaze with a glare of pure teenage contempt. When Hayes asked him to extend his arm, Elijah would do so with a deliberate, insolent slowness. "Are you enjoying the show, doctor?" he sneered during one examination, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Find anything else interesting about your pet freaks?" Dr. Hayes, to his credit, remained unflappable. "I am trying to understand your condition, Elijah, to help." "Help?" Elijah laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're writing in your little book. You think that's going to stop the next cut from splitting us all open?" The question hung in the air, sharp and painful. It was a question no one could answer. Isaac and Jacob, positioned on the settee, flinched. They had retreated even further into their shared silence. They watched the proceedings with wide, haunted eyes, their movements synchronized, their hands often finding each other's for silent reassurance. They were like two deer caught in the beam of a lantern, too frightened to bolt, too terrified to look away. Thomas and Martha observed from the periphery, their presence a constant, brooding weight. Thomas would stand in the doorway, his farmer's hands clenched into fists, his suspicion of Hayes warring with his desperate need for a cure. Martha would busy herself with mending or cleaning nearby, her ears tuned to every word, her face a mask of anxious hope. Their home was no longer their castle. It was a laboratory, and their sons were the specimens. After a week of observing the wounds, Hayes began his experiments. They were simple, non-invasive, yet they felt like a profound violation. He started with sensory responses. He'd strike a tuning fork and place it on Isaac's wrist. "Describe the feeling," he'd instruct the others. "A buzzing," Samuel would say, looking at his own wrist. "Right here." "Like a trapped bee," Jacob would whisper, his voice barely audible. Elijah would just grunt. "It's a vibration, so what?" But Hayes would write it all down. Subject C and D provide more imaginative sensory descriptions. Subject B remains resistant, but physical reaction is undeniable. He tested their reactions to temperature, pressing a small block of ice wrapped in cloth against Samuel's neck. Instantly, Jacob shivered. Isaac rubbed the back of his own neck. "Cold," they said in near unison. Elijah's jaw tightened. He refused to give the doctor the satisfaction of a verbal confirmation, but Hayes noted the subtle goosebumps that rose on his arms. The real tension began when the questions shifted from the physical to the emotional. Hayes, believing the key lay in their psychological state, began to probe their minds. He'd sit in his chair, his ledger open on his lap, and look at them with an unnerving intensity. "Do you ever share dreams?" he asked one afternoon. The air in the room grew thick. The boys looked at each other. It was a deeply private part of their connection they had never spoken of to anyone. Samuel cleared his throat. "Sometimes, not whole dreams, just feelings or a place. Sometimes we all dream of the creek or the barn loft." "And what do you feel in these dreams?" Hayes pressed, his pen poised. "Safe," whispered Isaac. "Trapped," muttered Elijah at the same moment. The contradiction fascinated Hayes. He scribbled it down. Fascinating. The same stimulus, opposing emotional responses. "Let's talk about the fight in the barn. Elijah, you felt anger. Samuel, you felt fear and regret. Isaac, Jacob, what did you feel?" Isaac stared at his hands. "Scared, it hurt, but the anger made it harder. This was a breakthrough. Hotter, Hayes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fervor. So the emotion changed the quality of the physical sensation. It always does, Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. Being scared is a cold pain. Being angry is a hot one. Being stared at by a doctor in your own house, he trailed off, looking directly at Hayes. That's a different kind of pain altogether. A dull ache, like a tooth that needs pulling. A sudden, sharp throb of pain erupted behind Samuel's eyes. He winced, bringing a hand to his temple. Across the room, Isaac and Jacob mirrored the gesture almost perfectly. Elijah himself blinked hard, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it was replaced by his usual mask of defiance. "What was that?" Hayes demanded, his excitement palpable. "What did you just feel?" "Headache," Samuel managed to say. "It's gone now." Hayes looked at Elijah, a slow smile of understanding spreading across his face. "Your anger, your resentment towards me, it just created a shared physiological event. A psychogenic headache. Marvelous." That word, marvelous, was a match struck in a room full of gunpowder. Thomas, who had been silent in the doorway, took a heavy step forward. "That's enough, doctor. You're upsetting them." His voice was a low growl. Hayes stood, holding up a placating hand. "Thomas, this is vital information. It proves my theory. Their emotional state is inextricably linked to their physical well-being. It's not just a response to injury. It's a constant, active feedback loop." "I don't care about your theories," Thomas snapped. "They're my sons, not an experiment for your book." "They are my patients," Hayes retorted, his professional calm finally cracking. "And their condition is escalating." That incident, that shared headache, was minor, but it was triggered by nothing more than a resentful glare. What happens when it's not just resentment? What happens when one of them feels true despair or hatred? Your isolation hasn't protected them. It has merely concentrated the problem. Martha stepped between them, her hands trembling. "Please, both of you, this isn't helping." Later that night, long after the buggy had rattled away, a heavy silence reigned in the farmhouse. In his office in town, surrounded by flickering gaslight and the comforting scent of old paper, Dr. Hayes reviewed his notes. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from exhilaration. Psychosomatic manifestation of shared consciousness. Emotional stimuli producing tangible, quantifiable, synchronous physical events. This was it. This was the discovery that would make his name. He could already see the title of the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. He could imagine the lectures, the acclaim, the respect from colleagues who had once dismissed him. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. Then, another image intruded on his triumphant thoughts. The look in Isaac's eyes, wide with a fear so profound it was almost silent. He saw the defiant pain in Elijah's face, a boy fighting the only way he knew how against a cage he couldn't see. He heard Martha's pleading voice and saw Thomas's impotent rage. They weren't subject C and D, they were children. For a fleeting moment, the weight of his ambition felt cold and heavy, a stark contrast to the hot thrill of discovery. He was walking a line, and he knew, with a certainty that both excited and terrified him, that he had no intention of turning back. The fragile truce within the Miller farmhouse held for another week, thin as a layer of frost on the window pane. Dr. Hayes, emboldened by his initial success, spent his days compiling pages of meticulous notes. He documented every shared headache, every sympathetic flinch, mapping the emotional currents between the brothers with the detached precision of a cartographer. In his mind, he was on the cusp of a groundbreaking medical publication, a discovery that would redefine the understanding of psychosomatic phenomena. The Miller quadruplets were no longer just boys. They were a living, breathing thesis. His ambition, however, was beginning to outpace his caution. One evening, as the family finished a tense, silent supper, Hayes cleared his throat, setting his fork down with a metallic click that drew every eye. Martha flinched, while Thomas's jaw tightened, already anticipating a fresh disruption. Thomas, Martha, Hayes began, his tone professional, yet laced with an excitement he couldn't entirely conceal. My observations have confirmed the psychogenic link beyond any doubt. But simple observation is no longer sufficient. To understand the triggers, we must learn to isolate them. To truly help them, we must provoke a reaction under controlled circumstances. Thomas placed his hands flat on the table. Provoke. What in God's name are you suggesting, Doctor? A controlled experiment, Hayes explained, turning his gaze to the boys, who were listening with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I propose we separate one of the boys for a short period, say, in the barn. Then, I would introduce a specific, mild emotional stimulus. For instance, I could recount a sorrowful story to Jacob and monitor the physiological responses in Samuel, Elijah, and Isaac, or induce a minor frustration in Elijah. By doing so, we can determine if specific emotions have unique physical signatures. It would be a significant step towards learning how to dampen or even sever these reactions. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Samuel looked down at his plate, his guilt coiling in his stomach. The idea of his brothers being experimented on because of him was unbearable. Elijah stared at Hayes with pure contempt, his knuckles white around his fork. He felt like a prized bull being sized up for the slaughter. It was Thomas who broke the silence, his voice a low growl. You will do no such thing. They are my sons, not specimens in a jar. You speak of mild stimulus, but what you mean is you want to make one of my children sad or angry on purpose just to see what happens. That is not healing. That is cruelty. Thomas, please, Martha interjected, her voice trembling. She was terrified by Hayes' proposal, but a desperate part of her clung to his confidence. If it could help them, if it could stop this. She gestured vaguely at her 4 sons, a single gesture encompassing a lifetime of shared pain and fear. It will not stop, Thomas said, his voice rising. Not by treating them like lab rats. This is our home, not your laboratory. The argument raged, cleaving the family once more. Hayes argued for scientific necessity, Thomas for paternal protection, and Martha was caught in the agonizing middle. In the end, Thomas's will prevailed. There would be no experiment. Hayes retreated to his room, frustrated, while the family was left fractured and more anxious than ever. That night, a storm of a different kind broke. It began not in the sky, but in the sleeping mind of Isaac. The quietest of the brothers, the artist who captured the world in charcoal sketches, harbored fears deeper and darker than any of them knew. His anxiety, suppressed during the day, roiled in his dreams. He dreamt he was at the edge of the swollen creek behind their property, the water brown and churning after a spring thaw. In the dream, the muddy bank gave way, and he tumbled into the icy torrent. The sensation was instantaneous and absolute. In the bed across the room, Samuel shot upright, gasping. His lungs burned, his chest seized by an invisible vice. It felt as though he'd been plunged into frozen water, the shock stealing his breath. He clawed at his throat, his mind reeling in confusion. A choked gasp came from Elijah's bed. He was awake, too, thrashing against his blankets, his face a mask of fury and panic. What is this? I can't breathe, he rasped, the words catching in his throat. Jacob was whimpering, curled into a tight ball, his hands pressed against his sternum. His eyes were wide with a terror that had no source, a pure primal fear that had invaded him from the ether. But the epicenter was Isaac. He was still asleep, but his body was rigid, his breathing shallow and ragged. A faint blue tinge colored his lips. He was drowning in his sleep, and he was taking his brothers with him. The commotion of 4 boys simultaneously fighting for air was loud enough to wake the dead. Martha and Thomas burst into the room, their lantern casting frantic, dancing shadows on the walls. They saw a scene of pure chaos. Samuel on his feet, stumbling and gasping, Elijah cursing and kicking at his sheets, Jacob weeping hysterically. Their eyes fell on Isaac, unnaturally still except for the frantic, shallow movements of his chest. "Isaac, wake up!" Martha shrieked, rushing to his side and shaking him violently. "For God's sake, Isaac, wake up!" Dr. Hayes arrived moments later, drawn by the screams. He took in the scene, not with the panic of a guardian, but with the electrifying focus of a scientist witnessing a supernova. He saw four distinct bodies experiencing a singular, catastrophic event originating from a non-physical source. It was horrifying, but it was also the ultimate proof of his theory, magnified 1,000-fold. As Martha's shaking finally broke through the nightmare's grip, Isaac's eyes flew open with a final shuddering gasp. Air flooded his lungs, and with it, the connection was reset. In an instant, Samuel could breathe again, collapsing onto his bed in heaving sobs. Elijah's rage subsided into exhausted pants, the phantom pressure in his chest vanishing. Jacob's weeping softened to a confused whimper. The feeling was gone, but the terror it left behind was a physical presence in the room. Isaac, now fully awake, looked at the faces of his brothers and saw his nightmare reflected in their eyes. The realization of what he had done, of the terror he had inflicted upon them from the depths of his own mind, crashed over him. A raw, guttural sob escaped him. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his notebook already in hand. "Remarkable," he breathed, his voice filled with a clinical awe that was utterly deafening in the emotionally charged silence. The trigger wasn't an external event, it was internal, a dream, a subconscious fear made manifest across all four of them. The psychic link is even more powerful than I imagined. That was the final straw for Thomas Miller. He turned from his weeping, terrified sons and faced the doctor. The farmer's face, usually weathered and stoic, was contorted with a righteous fury that seemed to shake the very floorboards. "Remarkable," he roared, his voice cracking with rage and grief. He snatched the notebook from Hayes's hand and hurled it against the wall, where it fell to the floor with a pathetic flutter of pages. "My sons were suffocating. They were in terror, and you call it remarkable? You see this as a discovery. I see your failure. You came here promising to help, but all you have done is watch and write and make them feel like freaks in their own home. Your presence here, your constant prodding, it is making things worse. You are poisoning them with this cold curiosity." He advanced on Hayes, his large frame casting an imposing shadow. "I wanted a doctor. I got a ghoul feeding on my family's misery." Thomas pointed a trembling finger toward the door, his eyes blazing. "Get out," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house." Now, the slam of the farmhouse door echoed with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Miller home. Dr. Hayes was gone. Outside, the wheels of his buggy crunched over the frozen mud of the lane, the sound growing fainter until it was swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the Illinois prairie. Inside, the silence was heavier, thick with unspoken words and the lingering ozone of Thomas's fury. He stood with his back to the room, his broad shoulders heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Martha was a statue by the cold hearth, her face pale, tears tracing clean paths through a light dusting of flour on her cheeks. She had seen a flicker of hope in Hayes's science, a hope now extinguished by her husband's protective rage. The four brothers stood clustered together, not by choice, but by an instinct that had governed them for 14 years. The phantom sensation of drowning had receded, leaving behind a bone-deep chill and the raw, scraped feeling of shared terror. For the first time, they saw their father not as an unshakable authority, but as a man pushed to his absolute limit. The sight was more frightening than any of Dr. Hayes's instruments. Thomas finally turned, his eyes finding his sons. The fire in them was gone, replaced by a profound, aching weariness. "He will not touch you again," he said, his voice raspy. "No one will. This is a family matter. We will bear it as a family." That night, a new, unspoken pact was forged in the cold attic room they shared. With the specter of Hayes's clinical curiosity gone, they were left with only each other. It was Samuel, the natural mediator, who spoke first into the darkness. "We can't let it happen again." The fighting, Elijah lying stiffly on his cot, the memory of his anger feeling like poison, mumbled, "It was my fault." "It was all of ours," Jacob's quiet voice interjected from the corner. He was right. Elijah's anger had been the spark, but Samuel's stubbornness had been the tinder, and Isaac's fear had been the fuel. They were a closed circuit, and the surge had nearly destroyed them. From that day forward, they began a new, more difficult experiment, one of empathy. They learned to read the weather in each other's expressions, to sense the rising tide of anger in Elijah, and soothe it with a shared task, to feel the tremor of Isaac's anxiety and ground it with quiet company. They started talking, truly talking, about the small joys and the large fears that echoed between them. Their connection, once a source of confusion and pain, slowly began to transform. It did not cease to be a burden, but it also became their greatest tool for survival. The years turned. The boys grew into men, their bodies hardened by the rhythms of the farm. The world outside their property line continued to spin, but their world remained the 160 acres their father had tamed. Thomas and Martha grew old, their faces maps of love and worry, and were eventually laid to rest in the small family plot by the creek. The brothers, now in their late 30s, ran the farm themselves, a four-man engine of seamless cooperation. They were known in the nearby town of Fairfield as the quiet Miller brothers, strange and reclusive, but honest in their dealings. No one knew the truth of their bond, only that they were inseparable. They had learned to manage the pain. A cut finger on Jacob while mending a fence was a sharp, shared sting that passed. A headache from Samuel after a long day of bookkeeping was a dull, collective throb. They had built walls of tolerance around the smaller pains, but they had never been tested by the ultimate pain, not since the nightmare of the drowning. That test came in the brutal winter of 1894. They were 40 years old. A bitter cold had locked the land for weeks, freezing the embarrassed river solid, or so it seemed. A young calf, spooked by a predator, had bolted from the barn and onto the ice-covered river. Isaac, whose gentle nature made him the caretaker of the animals, went after it without a second thought. He was halfway across when the ice, weakened by a deep current, gave a sickening groan. In the barn, mending harnesses, Samuel, Elijah, and Jacob dropped their tools in unison. A horrifying cold, far beyond the winter air, seized them. It was a cold that sank into their bones, a wet, suffocating pressure that stole their breath. They stumbled out into the blinding white of the snow-covered fields, their eyes scanning wildly, already knowing. They saw him, Isaac, thrashing in a hole of black, churning water, his face a mask of shock and terror, and they felt everything. They felt the ice water sear his skin, the frantic, useless struggle of his limbs, the heavy weight of his waterlogged coat pulling him down. On the riverbank, Elijah collapsed to his knees, clawing at his own throat, his lungs burning for air they could not draw. Samuel fell against a sycamore, his heart hammering against his ribs in a chaotic rhythm, a phantom, drowning happening in the dry, freezing air. Jacob stood paralyzed, his mind consumed by a singular, overwhelming wave of pure primal fear as he felt his brother's consciousness begin to fray, to dim. They felt Isaac's final, desperate gasp. They felt the black water fill his lungs, the final, terrifying peace as the struggle ended. And then, a vast, echoing emptiness. A void opened up inside them where Isaac had always been. The connection, for the first time, was broken. The three surviving brothers lay gasping on the frozen ground, alive but irrevocably shattered, the ghostly sensation of a watery grave forever imprinted upon their souls. The 40 years that followed were a long, slow epilogue. The wound of Isaac's death never healed. It became a part of them, a phantom limb that ached with every cold front, every rainstorm. The farm continued, but the seamless engine was now missing a crucial part, and the work felt heavier. Elijah, always the most physically robust, was the next to go, 15 years later, a harsh winter brought on a bout of pneumonia that settled deep in his lungs. For anyone else, it might have been a recoverable illness. But for Elijah, every ragged breath was a terrifying echo of Isaac's drowning. The struggle for air sent waves of the old panic through the bond to his two remaining brothers. When he finally passed in his bed, Samuel and Jacob felt not just the grief of his loss, but a faint, ghostly repetition of that final surrender, the feeling of lungs giving up the fight. He had not drowned in water, but in the memory of it. Samuel, the steady center, lived another decade. He had carried the weight of his brother's emotions and the farm's logistics his entire life. The decades of shared stress, the shock of Isaac's death, the strain of Elijah's illness, it had all taken a silent toll. In the autumn of 1919, his heart, a muscle that had beaten for 4 men, finally gave out. Jacob was in the kitchen when it happened. He felt no warning, only a sudden, immense, crushing pressure in his chest, as if the whole world had dropped on him, followed by an abrupt and total silence in the space where Samuel's steady presence had always hung. The connection had severed again. Now there was only Jacob. He lived on for another 15 years, a quiet, solitary old man in a house built for a crowd. The farm was mostly leased out. He was the sole keeper of a lifetime of shared memory, the lone survivor of a singular human condition. The bond was now just an echo chamber, filled with the ghosts of his brothers. He felt their absence more profoundly than he had ever felt their presence. In the spring of 1934, 40 years after Isaac had gone into the river, Jacob passed away in his sleep. He was 80 years old. There was no specific illness, no dramatic event. A doctor would have called it old age. But those who knew the story, a story pieced together from Jacob's quiet confession to a local pastor in his final years, knew the truth. He had died the same way as his brothers. He died of the connection. His heart, the last one beating in a 4-part rhythm, simply came to a gentle stop, its long, extraordinary work finally done. He died from a lifetime of feeling everything, and in the end, there was simply nothing left to feel. The pain that had defined them, the bond that had sustained them, had finally, mercifully found its peace.